Good evening. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of the Miami University Alumni Association's webinar series, today we present Beyond Optics, a discussion about inclusion. Joining us for today's conversation are Julie Elberfeld and CEC Dean Dr. Bina Sukumaran. Julie Elberfeld, a 1986 alumna, is an experienced Fortune 100 divisional CIO and executive champion for diversity and inclusion in technology. She is a diversity and inclusion strategy consultant to executives and currently serves as the interim CTO for workforce nonprofit Opportunity at Work. Julie was formerly a Capital One Senior Vice President and Commercial Bank CIO, as well as the executive sponsor of Tech Diversity and Inclusion Efforts, where she founded Women in Tech, WIT, and many other programs to drive a more diverse and inclusive workforce in technology. Dr. Bina Sukumaran is Dean of Miami's College of Engineering and Computing. Previously serving as Vice President for Research at Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey, she received a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the College of Engineering in Trivandrum, India, and a master's in civil engineering from Auburn University. She also earned a doctorate from Purdue. Bina was also principal investigator for the NSF's Revolutionizing Engineering and Computer Science Department grant titled Revolutionizing Engineering Diversity, also called RevEd. The grant looked at strategies to grow representation of women, underserved groups, and ethnic and racial minorities in engineering, while enhancing inclusion through curriculum design, teaching, and learning. She has also been involved in various outreach activities to recruit more ethnic and racial minorities, women, and underserved groups in engineering. Welcome to Julie and Bina, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Just a note to our viewers, questions were collected during registration, and Bina and Julie will attempt to address some of those throughout the webinar today. You will also have the option to ask questions during the webinar by clicking Ask a Question at the bottom of your screen. Please note that in the interest of time we have available, we may not get to every question. Today's webinar will last about an hour, including time for those questions and answers. So with that, I will turn it over to Bina and Julie. Thank you and welcome to you both.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
Thank you, Molly. Yes, and it's very nice to see you. Well, I wish it was in person, Julie, but it's good to be here on screen and chat with you about this very important topic that is impacting our industry, I would say, in terms of engineering and technology. So I wanted to start with you and see what is your story about your early career experience?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Bina. It's so nice to be here, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to chat with you about this topic, and it's just so incredibly important. And I think my orientation towards some of the challenges of diversity in the tech industry were more recently founded because in my early career, I was a math major at Miami, and I set out in my career and was fortunate to be offered an opportunity to work in what we call then data processing, and to become a software engineer or computer programmer at a bank in Cincinnati. And in those days, this was the late 80s, women were sort of at their peak of representation. My department was at least 40% women. And so I didn't really have a strong sense of gender identity relative to my work because it just didn't seem unusual to me. There were a lot of women. I didn't feel as if I didn't belong. I was welcomed. I was, encouraged, supported, had great opportunities to advance. And I also think the culture was pretty different then than it is now. We were pretty much in the back office. People didn't know anything about what we did. This was before, personal computers were in everyone's home. And so it was kind of mysterious, those people that do the computing in the back office. And we were maybe, we kind of wore a badge of honor of being like nerds. Yes. We actually liked that. And it just felt like we were more like scientists really loving what we were doing and really scaling out solutions for the business. So I think things changed a lot, but my early introduction into the field when women were not underrepresented, I think sort of masked for me some of the problems that transpired in the intervening years until more recently.
Yeah. So, so along those lines, right? So you said you didn't see very much underrepresentation, at least in terms of gender. What about racial minorities, other groups within the profession?
Great question. I have to say two things. One is I grew up and worked in the Midwest, which I think was, just going to present more challenges relative to racial and ethnic diversity. But the field generally has, was never well represented, as particularly for Black and Hispanic populations and Indigenous people. I think because of the work that was done in India, quite honestly, you do see a lot more South Asian people in the computing field,
Yeah.
and in East Asian as well. But the Black and Hispanic population, as well as Indigenous, have not been well represented in tech ever, really.
Yeah, and my experience in this area, in fact, I started my undergraduate in India, and in that region in India, my class was actually 50% women in civil engineering in the 80s. So I didn't think it was, there was a gender issue, but until I came to the US for graduate school. And that's when, I looked around my classroom and I just saw missing populations, right, of women, of underrepresented minorities. And then as I started my career as a faculty member at Rowan, we were starting a new engineering program. And that is when it really hit me. And I had gotten involved with the Women's Studies group on campus, as well as other different groups on campus. And I just felt that we were missing a large section of the population. And in New Jersey is a very diverse state. And we were surrounded by very diverse communities, but they were not in our classroom. And I just, so it started, I would say for me in the late 1990s when I was looking around my classroom. From then on, we started lots of outreach efforts to middle school because they said you have to target them in the middle school ages because that is when they make their decisions and so on. So we started doing that, but that didn't change our percentages, so it was a persistent problem. So in engineering, I think, we have a much more persistent problem, but a bit different from tech, right? So I wanted to ask about that. What happened in the technology fields like computer science and programming?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because I think you think that issues that you might view as kind of rooted in social issues improve over time, not get worse over time.
Yeah.
I think it is always terribly surprising to people that in the US that women's representation in computing peaked in 1990 at 40%. Computer science graduation rates for women peaked in the late 80s at 37%. And since then, the numbers have been progressively going down. And so women now are only like 25% of the industry. They're only 19% of computer science graduates. And so you see this just like backwards trend of what you normally expect. And there's some really interesting, this is when I first got involved with this 7 years ago or so. This was really something that intrigued me. I was like, what happened? Because I said, I didn't have a strong gender identity, so I think I missed that things were changing around me. And so the research really shows that, historically women did a lot of the software engineering. In fact, I think if you look at historically, the kind of more prestigious job was in hardware engineering. And so where did men gravitate? They gravitated to hardware engineering, and women were doing the software engineering, but it was almost viewed as clerical. In fact, it was Margaret Hamilton, I think at NASA, that introduced the concept of software engineering to try to elevate the job to be at the same level of hardware engineering. And so you kind of have a lot of women, right, who were doing the software engineering as men were doing more hardware. And then in the 90s, with the advent of the personal computer, pretty much everything starts to change. The advertising, I have some photos that, when I'm doing a webinar where I can, show more slides and things, the advertising is fascinating. It was all targeted at men and at boys. And you even see ads with women looking over the shoulders of men, like they're so amazed at what they're doing in the computing space. And so you start to create this narrative that women don't really belong. It's too heady for them. It's the space of men and boys. Hollywood starts to perpetuate that with the movies that start to come out. And so you start to create this stereotype of who belongs and who does computing. And all the software starts to follow, right? So the software starts to be financial and games and things that are kind of more appealing to men and boys. And so you then, and also software starts to become king, right? And I say king for a reason, because you start to see now men gravitating away from hardware and more to software as well. And so then you couple with that the dot-com bust and outsourcing of jobs in the early 2000s. And you just saw this rapid decline of new entrants into computing, a lot of people leaving the field because of, some of the loss of jobs. And then women just never returned at the same numbers because of these stereotypes. And I think for people of color, the stereotype combined with culture, access, different access to technology in terms of different communities, has perpetuated the problem for people of color as well. So that's kind of the history of what happened. And so you just kind of coupled a lot of changes in the way that computing is viewed and who belongs in it, based on some pretty invalid stereotypes about what the job actually is. I'm really curious for you, Bina, you mentioned this, that in your course in India that, you were, pretty well represented. Have you been able to sort of trace back in your history why things were so different in India than they were here in the US? Because I think there's something to be learned from that, right?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, I even started doing some research on that to do a cross-cultural comparison, right? And this is a region of India I come from, where women have always, I would say, 50% of my professors were women. So it started even a generation before I did start on the profession. And so looking at that region of India, there are some cultural factors. So we did have a matriarchal, system in the state. That doesn't mean, we still have patriarchy alive and well. But it was also a difference in employment opportunities, right? So if you look at employment opportunities, we were told even when we were very young, you either had to go into the medical field or you had to go into the engineering and tech field, because those were the only two areas in which you even had a remote chance of getting a job. So when I graduated, even with an engineering degree, the unemployment was 30%. So, so think about that. It has changed from that. India, the economy has changed and the employment picture. But you did have lots of people with advanced degrees that would do jobs that here, someone with a college degree would not, right? So I think it was the difference in employment. But if you looked at different engineering disciplines, you had gender parity in civil engineering, you had gender parity in electrical engineering. Mechanical was one area where we didn't. And there was this perception that mechanical engineering dealt with all this heavy machinery, maybe, it's not very woman friendly, so they didn't gravitate. But electrical engineering was seen as something that is friendly to women, But here it is just the reverse, right? Because, and I'm not sure what the perception is, but there is a perception that electrical tends to be much more mathematical, and I don't know, you don't get very many women. If you look at nationwide statistics in the US, that is one discipline in which women have been lagging a lot. So there are cultural, economic differences that might drive that. There have been actually quite a few studies looking at cross-cultural factors. And in fact, some of the areas where you do see a high percentage, at least speaking from a gender perspective, is some of the countries in the Middle East. So there are some studies being done on that as well. But I don't think we've zeroed in on what makes them gravitate to the professions, because there, again, the economic situation is quite different from India or the US. But economics is not the full explanation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think this stereotype thing threads through some of this, and what parents believe, and then what they tell their children as a result of what they believe about what the field is going to be like, or what your job opportunities are going to be, and things like that. So I know some of the folks that I've worked with from other countries say, like, hey, my parents were telling me from a young age, like you said, like, if I'm not going to be a doctor, I better go into tech. And it just wasn't ever a question that was a good field for me. Whereas here, I think a lot of parents are telling their children not to go into this field because they hear about some of the cultural challenges.
That is true. And I also do think that, I never heard the message, and I'm sure you didn't either, that women couldn't do math or science, right? I never got it in my household.
Nope.
But I know that, my daughter went to school here. She didn't hear it at home. She heard it from her peers. So she did have some of that peer pressure that would tell her that maybe you don't belong in science or math classroom, you don't belong in the programming classroom, and so on. So there might be, there are different factors that can impact someone's decision, right? Other than the family circumstances. So
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So what made you pick banking, Julie?
Yeah, I mean, I spent, 34 of my 35 years in banking. And so it was somewhat happenstance, right, originally, and that when I was actually going to graduate school at Miami in math and decided to not go into academia. And I was fortunate to have someone I knew offer me an opportunity to work in software in the data processing department at a bank here in Cincinnati, Fifth Third, for those who are local to the region. And it was, it was, somewhat happenstance. I didn't go pick banking, and I didn't really go pick to be a computer programmer, but that was kind of where things turned out. And as I got more into it and over the years, realized the kind of impact that we have in banking on people's ability to save, on access to credit, and how incredibly important really money and banking is at the center of people's lives. And then the fact that when you work on the software side of it, you're creating the actual product. Like if you think about the way that people interact with banks, right? It is directly with the technology. And so that idea that I was doing something at scale that made a difference in people's lives was really compelling to me. And I just felt like I was getting to do something I enjoyed in building technology, but I was getting to do it for something that was meaningful.
Yes. So when I talk to our students, right, especially those who are in the computer science, the so-called tech fields, right, there is a fascination for them to get jobs with entities like Facebook or Amazon or Google or Apple, right? So you went into banking. So what would you say are, if you were to advise a student, where would you ask them to look?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's an important and compelling question. And I think this is part of, again, this narrative that people play and the stereotypes that come into it. I mean, the reality is that, that group you talked about, you hear them called the FANG group, right? Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. Sometimes people have Microsoft in there. But, that group of companies that we think of as the tech companies, right? Really, in fact, they're businesses who realized that technology was a differentiator, right? In a business strategy that was very much based on technology. But in the reality of it, Amazon is a retailer, right? They started selling books and now they're kind of a logistics company. And yes, their AWS business is a tech business, but these, organizations, these companies that we call tech companies are really just businesses who've embraced technology at its foundation. And yet the reality is that is the digital economy in which we live today. And so every business, really, literally every business needs to be thinking about technology, and many are. And so the reality is most of the tech jobs are in the one minus the FANG group, right? And so although you can definitely go do some cool technology at some of those companies, you can do a lot of really meaningful things in other places. And if you're passionate around, doing something in healthcare, or you're passionate around safety or energy, or, countless the environment, there are tech jobs in all of those fields versus, going to a company that's basically doing advertising or retail. That's where your passion is. You can do some cool tech there, but you can really do some amazing technology outside of all of those fields. And so I think marrying your passions versus just being so fixated on the stardom of the group, I think is important for people to realize that there are more opportunities outside of those groups in tech than in them.
So I guess the $1 million question, right, Julie? Why does diversity matter in our professions? That is, in computing and engineering, why does it really matter?
I've had to give this thing a lot of thought, because when I started this work 7 years ago, here I was a tech executive, and I took it upon myself to start being a leader in technology, in the D&I space in technology. And people would ask me, like, so does it really matter that we have a pretty, homogenous set of folks working in the tech industry? And so I've thought about it a lot over time, and I always add more and more things to my list, but I'll kind of give some top things about why I think it matters. First of all, what I just said is that, we are in a digital economy. Every single business needs to be thinking about technology, and everything that's happening in our lives is being impacted by technology. And so when I think about the world that my grandchildren are going to live in, for example, that is going to be even more impacted by technology than the one we live in today, I think, gosh, do I want their future to be built by, this very homogenous group of mostly men and mostly white men in technology? Or do I want to see the empathy and experience of a broad group of people brought to bear on creating the technology of the world that they're going to live in? Yes, I do. And we're already seeing that mistakes are happening with, with creating technology groups that are just so homogenous. I mean, you're a really great example that's been in the media in the last year or so is around facial recognition software, where, you really, Joy Buolamwini did some awesome work at MIT around, what was at the root cause of why facial recognition software just wasn't identifying women, especially women of color, effectively. And it really got down to the training data sets that were used were not representative of the population. I always say they were more representative of the people who worked in technology. Very white, as she calls the training data set, very pale and very male. and so, what does the model learn? The model learns a lot about, people with light skin and about men, but not, and you think, gosh, if that'd been a diverse group of people sitting around the table, would they have made those choices? I kind of think not, right? And there are other examples, even in the engineering field. The airbags, and you hear of situations where the reality is better decisions, better problem solving, more innovation happens with diverse teams, and that's just so incredibly important to the world we're going to create. But I will add one other thing into this, Bina, and it really has become, I guess, for me, the most core of my passion around this, and that is really the socioeconomic impacts. The reality is that tech jobs are in extreme demand. They're growing at 3 times the national average of other jobs. They're some of the top paying jobs. And so you have this huge disconnect, really, of who sees themselves in technology and who's getting those opportunities. And if we don't get women, and we don't get women of all races, and we don't get men of color into this field, then we're going to continue to perpetuate and exaggerate and expand what is already a wage gap between those populations. And so I just think it's unfortunate that we have, for all these bad reasons of stereotypes and culture, have blocked people from what can be a very rewarding field in terms of problem solving, but also a very economically rewarding field. And I just think, people need to have access to these jobs. And if they don't want them, that's fine. But if they want them, they should be able to have them and not be blocked because of a lot of other kind of systemic reasons that people are either not getting into the field or dropping out of it when they do.
Yeah. So you do see this as a big opportunity gap as well, you would say, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, what I think you hear all the time, that there's, a pipeline problem in technology. And no doubt there are some pipeline problems, as you said, your daughter's experience around, people giving the narrative that you have to be great at math and you have to be great at science, and girls don't do that, and girls don't. So there definitely are some challenges that we need to reverse that stereotype problem for young people, so they make the educational choices that could lead to these fields. But the reality is, we talk about this pipeline problem and this skills gap, and I see it more as an opportunity gap. I think there are so many people who would enjoy this work, who have the skills to do the work, and just need support structures to get in there and get an opportunity. The reality is, most companies are filtering out an awful lot of people based on where they went to school, what degree they have, whether or not they have a degree. I mean, the reality is, I think 18% of software engineers don't have college degrees. You can do this job without a college degree. Nothing wrong with having one, but you can do it without a college degree. And yet most companies are blocking the opportunity for people without degrees. So what I think is referred to as a skills gap and a talent gap is absolutely an opportunity gap.
Yeah. So how do we bring about change, Julie? How would, we talked about the pipeline, and I know some people hate that analogy even, right? But if you think about it, there have been studies that have shown that by age 5 or 6, the stereotype threat is already evident from studies that have been done on young children. Who says that they are good in math or good in science? You can see that difference already surfacing. So how do we bring about systemic change?
Yeah, I think, the problem in the lack of diversity in the tech industry, in particular in engineering, I think it perpetuates into other fields of engineering, are complex and broad, right? And so no doubt we need to do something to change the experience in the K through 12 level. We need to, stop this narrative that girls can't do math. And quite honestly, that, math isn't the only skill that is critical or necessary for some of these fields anyway. So it's we kind of sometimes overemphasize even the great at math kind of thing. And so I do think that there are things that need to happen at the K through 12 level. We have to change the educational system. It still is befuddling to me in these extremely digital economy where every single company cares about technology, that we're not teaching technology as basic as reading, writing, math, right? I mean, it just is so fundamental to the future of kids today. So I
Yes.
think the more exposure kids get, I've seen it in some of the, I'm sure you've seen it too, in the programs where you work with these young people. And when they realize that at 8 years old or 10 years old, they can build an app and
Yeah.
they're so elated that they can actually do it. And it, isn't that overwhelming. And they're just so excited. Their world opens up in terms of the possibility. So we've got to do something to change that narrative in the K through 12 level. We have to stop the stereotype of telling girls that they can't do these jobs or even what the jobs are like. So I think we again, have this perception of what the job is like, and that has to change. I think there are two other places that I think I see tons of opportunity for change from the work that I've done. One is certainly at the university level, and I'd love your thoughts, and I'm sure the audience would love more of your thoughts on that. But I think it's one of the important places in the more immediate future that we can bridge the gap between what isn't happening yet in the K through 12 space with, between there and work. The unfortunate reality is that most of the research is showing that there are way more women and men of color interested in technology than actually finished degrees. They're either intimidated by weed out courses and class structures, and so they never even enter the field. And so I think we need to do more to encourage enrollment. And then I think the retention problem is huge. I mean, it's just a known fact, right? That there are, in many institutions, the entry level classes, the freshman classes may be 50% diverse. And then by the time we get to graduation, it's changed radically. And I think there are things like, changing the way the expectations of a freshman. Yeah, some people have been coding since they were 5, but if the only people who are welcomed and encouraged are the people who've been coding till 5, then we'll never catch the people who just got interested in this more recently and see this as a great job, right? And then, so you can structure things differently. They need support structures. The reality is stereotype threat is real. The feeling of isolation is real. I've got some good friends that work in nonprofits that are they're kind of taking it in their own hands to try to support college women, rewriting the code in 2040. They're taking women and Black and brown people and helping them get a sense of support so they make it through. I mean, that's it's sort of the narrative out there is like, gosh, you really need a support structure to make it through these majors. And so, some of that really needs to change at the university level. Did you want to add to the university side of it?
Yeah, for sure, Julie. So if you look at, just to speak from the Miami perspective, right? In our college, we are at about 21% women, which is sort of the national average. We are at about 16% underrepresented minorities. That is, if you consider domestic population, and then we have 20% international. So the one thing that we do a really good job on is that if we get diverse students, students of color, women, any of our students that come in, they do graduate. So our graduation and retention is something that we can be proud of.
That's great.
But the one area that we need to do work on is getting them to come, right? So that is something that we have to think about, and also think about different approaches. Like you said, right? Why do we say that you have to have all this intensive science and math background to be able to even come into the profession, right? Are we setting up these blocks for them even before they come in, or not even admitting them because they don't have these required courses? And there are lots of school districts across the nation that don't offer some of these courses even because it is tied to the, because our school districts are so local. Some of our rural school districts do not have. I mean, so you're leaving out sections of the population, right? As a result of some of the requirements that we put in place. And then once they come in, we say, you have to do this and you have to do that. And if they see that the first course that they're going into, let's say they go in there and they see that they are friends in there have had extensive background in this because of the schools that they went through.
Mhm.
They feel that they don't fit in, right? But what they don't realize is it's easy to catch up. And I think that is where professors can make an impact as well as advising can make an impact. And then I know that, we try really hard on the advising front. And there are other things. I mean, we can also teach more inclusively, right? So that is something that I would like all our professors to do. And when I talk about inclusive teaching, they always think that you have to bring in issues of race or gender into the classroom. That's not it. When we're talking about examples in the classroom, people like to see, role models that look like them, right? So can we think about more diverse role models that we feature? Can we talk about, if you talk about any engineering or computing design, there is an impact, right? You talked about it, the impact of not having a diverse workforce, what that results in. You can take any of our engineering fields and it's the same impact that we see. We talked about airbags, right? You can talk about, like, I'm a civil engineer. If I talk about highway design, in fact, with when the interstate system was designed, that is when we started seeing more segregation and, people of color being moved out of certain areas into certain neighborhoods and, where poverty started taking root and so on, right? So there are things that engineering decisions and engineering design impacts, but we don't discuss this in our classrooms. So I think there's room for that in our curriculum, but it is a question of, we have to get our professors comfortable enough to discuss that, right? And because they were trained in a system where this was not discussed. So now there has to be a mind shift to make that, part of the training that they impart for future generations.
Yeah, and I will tell you that I think it's terribly important because I think the just the sheer numbers that create the sense of isolation, the lack of inclusion, the lack of an inclusive culture, the discussion at the college level, it perpetuates into the workforce.
Yes,
right.
It does.
So if the young men who are going through the program now become the managers and they've sort of learned in that environment of like who belongs and, they haven't been taught the importance of inclusion and building the best product and thinking about the end user, then it perpetuates into the workforce. So yeah, I think those are all really important. I think understanding like jobs like I did, that there are people like me that did jobs in banking that were great jobs, that were mission driven, just encouraging the students to think about that there was a broad set of jobs, not just the ones like, at the FANG group that everybody talks about, but, and I think just encouraging, thinking of growth mindset and just encouraging the growth is key. And look, there are important things that need to be done in the education system. My focus personally and my passion and what I think is the absolute linchpin is really in companies. And for all of the work that could be done by universities and educate, K through 12 education and policy and government and all the things that could be done, the more immediate kind of change agent is in fact in companies. That's where the funding is. That's where the job demand is. And really, truly, I think, I started this work 7 years ago in tech. Since then, company after company has announced millions and millions of dollars. There have been billions of dollars pledged on changing this diversity problem in tech by companies. And yet the numbers have really barely budged. And in some cases are worse than they were 7 years ago. And so I unfortunately think a lot of companies want to write a check, but they expect that someone else is going to solve this problem for them. And they talk about this pipeline problem. And yet the reality is that there's a huge retention problem as well. So part of the reason the diversity has not improved is because even the people that are going into the field, women and men of color, they're not staying at nearly the same rate as their majority peers. And so that kind of harkens back to there's a cultural issue, right?
Yeah.
There's some of this change that occurred that I said where it's really different than it was when I entered the field. This change that happened with the dynamic of who are in the power roles in the technology space has changed the culture as well,
Yeah.
and not as welcoming. And so people aren't staying. And so I think companies really have to own up to their responsibility in this. And I think leaders in technology really have to stop outsourcing this problem.
Yeah.
They outsource it inside their company to HR, and then they outsource the underlying root problem to societal norms in K through 12 and government, and instead of looking really internally and saying there are millions of open tech jobs, the cost of labor is going through the roof as a result of this whole supply demand disconnect. And yet, we still perpetuate this problem. So you really have to think differently about the talent strategies. And, I talked earlier about, changing the way that you think about the profile of someone who can come into a tech role. And there's so much pedigree hiring in the tech field. It is just incredible the degree to which talent is filtered out on university, on computer science degrees, yet there are so many other people that really could be a part of it.
Yes.
But it starts with really owning up to the fact that companies, in fact, are in a position to create a different narrative, to create a different demand picture, and really, instead of just writing checks, work collaboratively across the industry with universities, with other nonprofits that are trying to change this, and really crack the nut instead of just kind of writing a check and hope somebody else fixes the problem. So I think companies are really at the root of this, and so that's where I'm kind of trying to spend a lot of my time.
Thank you, Julie, for that. There are lots of questions filtering in.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, so this came in as a female developer who also teaches programming to those who are new to the subject. How can I better welcome students into the field, especially those who are underrepresented?
Oh, that's awesome. So so this is someone who's was a computer scientist and a teaching?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's some of the things that we've talked about in my mind is, make sure the history's understood, make sure that they know they belong, remove the stereotype threat by saying women have always been involved in computing from the get-go, all the way back to the ENIAC machines, right? Men did the hardware, women programmed the ENIAC machines. Women have always been a part of this. They can do it. They like it. You're going to have an opportunity to solve problems that I think for women in particular, and I think this is true of other underrepresented populations, if you feel like you've been in a more, marginalized group, you have this passion to solve problems. And technology is an amazing way to solve problems at scale. So really helping the women see, pick a problem that you want to solve, and then let's figure out technology as the means to the end of solving the problem, not just tech for tech, right? But really, how do you use it to solve problems, create those role models, and really build up the confidence in those young women that this is absolutely an amazing field where you can do amazing things and be radically successful, but also let them learn the skills that they need. Women so often get relegated to doing the project management or build the PowerPoints or do the presentation. Let them learn the skills that are going to make them competitive as well.
Yeah. So this one came as a female computer science major. I serve as an executive member in Miami's student chapter of ACM, so Association for Computing Machinery, Women. Do you have advice for me as a student to recruit and support women and minority students in college?
Yeah. I mean, I think, some of this again comes back to what are trying to get at the root of like, what is someone's disconnect with why they might find this an appealing field. And I think the thing that's really interesting to me, and perhaps again is maybe an opportunity in the university environment, is this interdisciplinary view of computing. Because the reality is, I was a math major. I learned logical thinking. I learned how to solve problems in math, but I was able to then really apply that foundational thinking to what I was doing. I took a lot of business classes because I did a special interest area in business. So when I got into banking and I needed to understand finance, some of my accounting and finance classes really came in handy. So I think the thing to think about is like, what is it someone really wants to do? What is a problem they want to solve? And what field are they interested in? And then marry sort of that, computing, understanding of computing with the field that they love and think about the problems that they could solve. Because every field, every discipline is being disrupted by technology.
Yeah, and I would add, on campus, I know that in our college itself, we have Girls Who Code, we have Code to Learn. In fact, that was started in-house at Miami. And they do work with the school districts in the area. They work, Code to Learn, in fact, works with elementary school students, and the Girls Who Code work with older students. But this is, I would say, as a student, if you want to make a difference, reach out to an underrepresented minority young person, reach out to a woman student in school, in middle school, high school, and tell them what you are working on. Tell them what is possible, right? Tell them why you enjoy the profession. I think that is also how we can open the doors to others who come, who follow us, right? I mean, that's why we are here, right, Julie, between you and me. I mean, that is why we are here, because we would like to see more people who look like us in our profession, and we want to open doors to future generations. There were some questions that came in even earlier. So this one is around the demographic shift. So over the next 20 to 30 years, we are expected to see a shift in demographics where non-Hispanic white citizens will make up less than 50% of the US population. Mm-hmm. Will this shift in diversity necessarily drive inclusivity? If not, how do we push for inclusivity now to set ourselves up for success in the future?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. Okay. So the 2040 is the beginning of the decade, and we will see what has been coined a majority minority, which is as a math major, I can't get that concept of majority minority. That doesn't work for me. But the question was framed very well. Wow. I mean, the reality of the basic answer is no, right? There is no guarantee that just because the demographic change, that inclusiveness changes. In fact, that couldn't have been more apparent to me than when I traveled to South Africa a couple of years ago, and I had done a lot of reading ahead of time, and it just became abundantly clear to me that power is what is really at play. And where does power lie? Because you look at a country like South Africa, for decades of the majority being the marginalized group, strong majority, not even a small majority, right? And so despite the fact that Black people in South Africa were the majority, they were definitely marginalized and did not have power through the entire apartheid era. So there is no guarantee that numbers create inclusiveness. Now, what I do think starts to change is that an individual person's likelihood of having a personal experience with someone different than them, especially, a white person like me that grew up in a town that had 2 Black families, I didn't have much opportunity to have that exposure to know from my own personal experience people that came from different races and ethnicities and backgrounds. But I think this population shift will cause more people to have those personal relationships that should open their eyes a little bit to things that they may not have appreciated. But that still does not necessarily change the power dynamic. And that is what we really have to start to think about. And we need to start now, right? We need people to start now to appreciate the history and the real marginalization of populations. And, I think this last year has been a tremendous opportunity for us to, if we chose to take a step back and really try to understand how just pervasive systemic racism is, and how if we don't really grasp with and tackle that just because the demographic changes, it doesn't mean the power structures change.
And Julie, in fact, along those lines, I sometimes use that argument about, because when I talk to people that are, let's say, not as committed to DEI as I am or you are, sometimes I do use that argument in that there is a changing demographics. There is also a huge need for engineers and technology-focused professionals, for people with that education. And we have seen study after study saying that as a nation, we will become less competitive because of the shortage of engineers and computer scientists, right? So sometimes I use that argument to let's say, get more funding, or even to get them on my side, right? So if someone is coming from that perspective where why should we change anything, I use this argument sometimes to try and convince them that it is necessary for the nation's success as well as for, our success.
Absolutely. And that comes back to a couple of the things I said earlier about why it matters, right? Like, we just have to have more diversity in the development of engineering products to meet the needs of the population. And if we block, because of culture, because of power plays, over half the population from thinking along in these fields, then we already have a huge shortage in tech. There were 300,000 open tech jobs in the middle of the pandemic, at the worst of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So such a shortage already. And then we block out a huge portion of the population, and we perpetuate the socioeconomic divide. Yeah. Again, it is absolutely an opportunity problem. People just need to open the doors to, a whole new population. There are so many people out there that can do tech. They just need to be given the chance.
Yeah. So this is the question, what's the best approach to or example of allyship that you have seen,
Allyship is a tricky question because it has a lot of definitions on what it actually means. And I'm a firm believer that in any given context, every single one of us has an opportunity to be an ally to someone else. As a woman in technology, I might be underrepresented, but I also rose to a great level of success. So I can be an ally to other women and represent their, try to use my privilege to advance their position. And so I think, and you don't, ally isn't a verb, right? It's really, it's not something that you get to wear as a badge of honor. It's something that someone else has to tell you that you're doing. But I do think I've seen scenarios where people are really, truly open to realizing the ways in which they have contributed to the marginalization of a population. And I saw a really neat example of a male executive at my company who partnered with a woman, and they went to a conference, and it was a gender conference, and he came back from the conference, and he really started thinking about his own behaviors. Have I done this? Have I hurt women in their careers by some of the things that I have done? And he was someone who felt he was already pretty good manager, pretty high EQ. And I think most people would have agreed with that. But he realized he had created his own, that he had done this. He had done some of the things that he had learned. And so he came back and he said, I don't know how to do it. I'm going to need your help, but I want to be able to represent I want to take my own vulnerability, and I want to get other men to understand the way that we contribute to some of the marginalization that women have. And he went on a road show of doing talks, and he always did it. He and this woman partnered together and did it together so that they were always showing in their, he didn't try to show up as the guy that's going to save the day. He came with her and they talked together about their experience. And that was one of the, and he got a movement going then of support. And that was one of the better examples I've seen of how you can really approach allyship in a genuine way.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess I know we're coming to the tail end of our time, but so there was this question on how can we better prepare to better educate ourselves on diversity and inclusion in the tech industry for the future. So if we were to focus on the future, what are some steps that we could take,
Yeah, look, I think, we all have a lot to learn, right? Last summer, I'd been doing this for 6 years, and then I really dove into trying to understand more about racism and realized just how little I knew. And we all are like, oh, I didn't know this. And then you realize that the facts have been out there for years, decades, centuries. The facts have been there. And then we somehow just filter it out of our knowledge base and don't make the choice to dig in and understand. And so I think gaining knowledge, understanding the history, understanding what are the barriers that have been created, what's the truth about the history and the opportunity versus the barriers and narratives that have been created today, and understand the significance of technology in our future and how what we just talked about, the number of jobs, the importance of the jobs, the opportunity gap. I think just really understanding those things and those things can be learned through books and articles and listening to talks and really just appreciating that something really has to shift. It's just not okay that an amazingly great field that is so impactful on our future is really not being very open and inclusive to anyone except men and in particularly white men. And so in the United States anyway. And so I just think, we owe it to ourselves to understand the real facts and to start to influence the way people view the field and starting with those young people and getting them the role models they need to start to understand that this could be a great opportunity for them.
So in some ways, we have to give up some of our privilege to allow more people to come into our professions, right? We have to give up some of that.
You know what? Yes, and I will say yes and no. There are 350, 400,000 open tech jobs posted right now. It's not. This is why, sometimes people think in these diversity challenges or societal challenges that it's like a zero-sum game.
Yep.
Right? Like, in order for someone else to gain something, I give something up. In the truth of the matter, we all win, right? In the tech field, there's no loss. Nobody's losing a job because someone else got it, right?
Yeah,
There's simply not enough people being welcomed into the field. And so no one really has to give up anything. Like we have 300,000 open jobs now. It's going to continue to climb and, it's growing like 34, I think McKinsey says 34% growth in less than a decade. So, there's lots of room.
Yeah.
Maybe in the leadership level, Bina, we have to think about giving up some power at the leadership level to others.
Yes, I think we are ready to wrap up, Molly. And so if you want to.
Well, thank you to the two of you. I was just sitting here thinking about how I wish that I could have heard this 20 years ago, because I had no idea these opportunities existed. And, I was just a girl, and didn't really know that girls could do this too. And I think it's really important, as you said, Julie, to start early and start really pushing this K through 12 to help girls believe that they belong here too. So thank you so much for your work and for this dialogue. We really appreciate having you both. And of course, that's all the time we have for today. We appreciate the audience for being with us this evening. Just as a reminder to everyone, there is a recording of this presentation that will be available soon on our website. Thank you again to Julie Elberfeld and Dr. Bina Sukumaran for leading us in this conversation today. Such important words. And special thanks to the CEC Women's Advisory Council for their collaboration on today's webinar. Please check out our other webinar presentations at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Love and honor, and many thanks to you, Julie and Bina.
Thank you.
Thank you.